In May of 2018, I attempted to move to my family's cabin property in Etna, California. When I arrived, our gate across the easement road had been removed and was replaced with a fence. Just beyond the fence, a trench had been dug in the road to prevent vehicles from driving up to our property. One neighbor, Dan Deppen, arrived on the road and said that our family didn't own our property anymore. It was a ludicrous statement, and I didn't know why he had tried to convince me of something so nonsensical. The trench in the road was on Don Phelps' property, but our access road also crosses a small section of Deppen's property. Deppen also said that we did not have an easement across his property. I believed that we did because my family had been using the easement road to access our property for more than 60 years. Deppen was very rude and adamant that we did not have an easement. I called the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Department so that a deputy could enforce the easement in our deed, but the deputy refused to do so, and I had to leave with 2 truckloads and a trailer full of my belongings. I had to put those belongings into storage until I could get the matter resolved. My sister Amber and I consulted an attorney friend and showed her our easement. The attorney said that our easement was valid and we had every right to access our property. So I returned to the property the following weekend with another truckload of my belongings, and I brought 2 shovels. My sister and I filled in the trench with the shovels, and at the moment when I was ready to cut the fence and drive my truck through, another deputy arrived. I showed him our easement, and the deputy should have allowed me to access our property, but the deputy refused. He asked that I not proceed until the following Monday after I could go to the courthouse with him to prove that my family still owned the property. I agreed, and I met with the deputy that Monday. I proved our ownership of the property, and then the deputy wanted an expert opinion on our easement, so we went to Mount Shasta Title Company, and the manager read over our easement and said that it was valid and could not be abandoned without us doing so in writing. The deputy still did not allow me to access our property and said that I needed to sue Phelps in court. I spent some time traveling and staying with friends and family throughout California and Oregon, and I ended up meeting an electrician named Dan who helped me with an electrical project. We became friends, and Dan needed a place to stay, so I told him that he could stay with me on our property once I got things ironed out. We went to the property and discovered that the cabin had been burglarized, sabotaged, and ransacked. The food that I had stored there had been dumped out in the cabin to attract vermin, and the storage containers were broken and thrown outside. All of the light switches and electrical outlets were removed, along with the propane furnace. We have a mountain spring on our property that fed fresh water to the cabin. The spring water collected in a wooden spring box, and the top of that box had been pried apart and a dead animal carcass was thrown in our water supply. Dan stayed at the cabin a few days while I took a trip to Los Angeles, and during that time, Dan was threatened by Deppen and Phelps. Dan was told that he would be arrested if he did not leave. The Hardaways allowed Dan to stay on their property until I returned from my trip. I purchased some surveillance cameras and placed them around the property to hopefully get evidence in case any more acts of vandalism were committed. Dan and I went back to the cabin a couple weeks later, and the cameras had captured Don Phelps trespassing on our property and looking over all the damage that was done. It appeared as if he knew that the cabin had been vandalized. Phelps went up to the mountain spring as well. I tried to report the vandalism and theft to the sheriff's department, but the deputy that I spoke to on the phone said that I could not give a report because my family no longer owned our property. He said that Deppen had spoken to Sheriff Lopi and convinced him that we did not own our property anymore and we were squatters. I made a few attempts to also get an appointment to meet with Sheriff Lopi so that I could show him that Deppen had lied to him, but my requests were ignored until I sent a certified letter. It took several weeks to finally get the appointment. Dan and I had been camping by a creek a few miles away from the property. We drove into Wairika almost every day to look up court records, property deeds, and public works maps. We discovered 2 county maps that show our easement road, and we acquired all of the county assessor's maps of properties in the area. We discovered that the easement in our deed allowed us to cross over Phelps' property, and because it was signed by a judge, the protocol of the sheriff's department was to enforce the easement, even though they had failed to do so previously. We also discovered that Deppen had used a corrective deed to illegally remove our easement from the property description in his deed. We were able to find the original deed to Deppen's property that contained our easement clause and several other documents that Deppen had recorded as late as 2008 that also contained our easement. When I finally got a meeting with Sheriff Lopi, I showed him the documents and explained the entire situation. Sheriff Lopi listened to what I had to say, he copied the documents that I brought, and he seemed to be neutral on the matter. He said that I could request a civil standby if I needed to access the property, and the deputy would ensure that I was able to get to our property without harassment from the neighbors. This was great, but it was now too late to try to rehabilitate the cabin since that work would have to be started in the early spring to be sure that critical repairs could be made before the winter hit. Also, another larger trench had been dug in the road at the same location as the previous one that my sister and I had filled in. When I was finally able to report the burglary and vandalism, Deputy Jacobson called Phelps' renter, Wayne Summers, and Wayne admitted to digging the trenches with a backhoe that was parked on Phelps' property about 40 or 50 feet away from the trench. While on the phone with the sheriff, Wayne denied ever having gone to our cabin, but he did admit to Bonnie Hardaway that he and Phelps had gone there and taken all of my ammunition. I was the only person that knew that I had any ammunition stored in the cabin, so I knew it must be true that Wayne and Phelps had indeed taken the ammo. An unopened can of Busch beer was left in the cabin. It was the same brand of beer that I had seen Wayne drinking every time I had encountered him while trying to access the cabin. I rented a room in Klamath Falls, Oregon until the spring of 2019 when I could try to move to the cabin again. Dan moved to Portland. I continued to research the court documents, case law, and civil code statutes to fully understand our rights and the claims that the neighbors had made regarding our easements. I consulted 2 more attorneys who thoroughly investigated all of the documents and advised me on our property rights. I secured title reports for our property and for the Deppen's property at a cost of $800. Both attorneys stated that I have every right to access our property, and the neighbors nor the sheriff could prevent me from going there. While I was staying in Klamath Falls, 5 more trenches were dug in the road on Deppen's property. It looked like a caterpillar had been used. There were caterpillar tracks all over the road. Another fence was erected across the easement road on Deppen's property. I loaded up my truck again in May of 2019 and headed out to the property. I rented a Bobcat, and my brother-in-law towed the excavator to the property so that I could repair the road. I filled in all the trenches on the easement road on Deppen's property and began to fill in the trench on Phelps' property when Dan Deppen appeared and tried to get us to leave. My sister and brother-in-law were there with me. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived and asked me to see our documents, so I showed them our easements, and the deputies left and allowed me to continue fixing the road and to move my belongings onto our property. 3 days after I'd fixed the road, I heard someone operating a caterpillar on the road. I walked down to see what was going on, and video recorded the events. Deppen was on the road with his wife. They were overseeing a cat operator who was digging new trenches in the road. Don Phelps was also there, and I met him for the first time. He was rude and obnoxious and threatened to shoot my dog, even though I had him on a leash and he hadn't done anything. A few days later, 3 large pine trees, 26 to 36 inches in diameter, had been fallen across the easement road. I posted an ad on Craigslist.org seeking a handyman who would want to move onto our property, live in the cabin, and help me to do some of the repair work that needed to be done. It was also important for me to have another person on the property to help me keep an eye on things, considering the threats of violence and crimes that had occurred. A guy named Eric Gustafson agreed to come out and help me. Eric was a lazy slob and was incapable of completing any task without messing it up in some way. He often lost tools or the parts for whatever I asked him to fix. I kept him around because I really needed someone to watch over the property when I needed to leave. Eric had lied to me about several things and had been stealing from me, so I ended up kicking him out. He left all of his garbage behind for me to clean up. I had been parking my truck on some BLM land about a mile to the south of our property. I had placed surveillance cameras near the truck, and the cameras captured Don Phelps walking around my truck and looking it over. He likely thought that I had left after the burglary and vandalism of the cabin. A couple weeks later, on January 30th, I was on a trip to Los Angeles to deal with a family emergency, and I received a call from Nick Pisano with CAL FIRE, who told me that our cabin was burned down. I cut my trip short and came back fearing that my trailer would be burned up next and I would have nowhere to live. So this is all that's left of our cabin after the fire in January of 2020. It pretty much destroyed everything. Our antique propane cooking stove there. And I had 2 wood stoves in the property. There's one, and there's the other one. And I had tons of tools and equipment in the cabin. So all of these tools were destroyed. All kinds of yard working tools, and then any kind of power tool you can imagine. Various wrenches and pliers and all that stuff. These are more tools that I had in the cabin. This is what remains of a nice brand new generator that I had. A guy named John Scalarud answered my Craigslist ad next. He had a lot of tools and knowledge to help me to do a lot of the work I needed to do. I really needed him to be there since all of my tools had burned in the cabin fire. John arrived with no plan for how to get his RV trailer onto our property. He was also broke and didn't even have a way to charge his cell phone. I had to buy him food and give him a solar panel phone charger, which he never returned. John never got his trailer onto our property and left it parked on BLM land for about a month. He ended up leaving after talking with Don Phelps. John told me that Phelps told him that I burned our cabin down and that I was using John. John apparently believed Phelps' nonsense and sent me some bizarre and accusatory text messages. He threatened that I was going to find myself in a world of serious disappointment. I responded saying that it sounded like he had lost it completely, and he sent a message back saying, "You were warned." 6 days later, a brush fire broke out on our property in the same location where John used to walk in from where his trailer was parked. So in July of 2020, I was sitting in my trailer and heard a weird crackling noise, and so I came out to see what was going on, and there was a fire started in the grass here. And I'm standing now in the southeast corner of our property facing east, and this is about where the fire started. Well, not where I'm standing, but around here in this spot. So maybe 20 or 30 feet away from, maybe 30 feet away from this big pine tree. And the flames were maybe about 10 feet long by 3-4 feet wide when I first noticed it. And I began running and bringing over buckets of water to dump on the fire. Each time I returned, the fire was getting larger in size and spreading in all directions, but it was mostly headed toward the south or southeast. That's the direction that the wind was blowing. And I knew that if the fire reached this bush, this was a sage bush that was standing here, and I knew once it reached that large bush, it was going to be out of control. So once it did catch that bush on fire, I had stopped trying to prevent the fire from spreading to the south and went down the hill to call 911 to report the fire. And then I came back up and tried to prevent the fire from burning up all of my stuff. So I had a bunch of really nice oak burls here that I had collected and was going to make stuff out of. And so the fire kept spreading this direction, which would be roughly west. And it burned all of those burls. There was a water bucket here that I was using to put out the fire. And I dropped that, remembering that I had a fire extinguisher, but it was a small one. So I used that. It didn't last very long, but I tried to use it to put out the fire. And when that was done, I went back to the buckets of water and kept pouring them. And the fire was kind of moving its way around here. I thought it might end up burning this makeshift shed that I had constructed. So I kept dumping water on it and kept pushing the fire back. And then it started coming close to the garden. Then the fire had snaked around the garden. And caught this big sage bush on fire. And the heat from that melted my tubs here that I had stuff growing in. And I also had a really nice burl piece here that I had made. And I unfortunately didn't rescue it. The fire crew had arrived at that time, and I asked if I should leave. And they said yes, so I just left the burl piece laying there, and it eventually got burned too as the fire continued to spread further to the west. And it burned all this area out to the south. And the fire also continued to spread here further east and started going north. So again, this is the area where the fire started here, and it continued to climb up the hill, spreading further north and to the east. Up the hill here until the fire crews had arrived and started to contain it. And they had cut line around to these two pine trees here, just in front of these two pine trees, to prevent the fire from spreading there and catching those trees on fire. And then the adjacent property here to the south went up, and I'd estimate at least 20 acres were burned on Phelps' property there.